As we saw in the last session, theory is a conceptual system or a set of ideas that both inform as well as authenticate architectural decisions. In other words, a theory tells us that what we are doing is the right thing to do. What this implies is that man is seeking a coherent logic with which he can be assured that all his decisions are in order. And that theory, we also found out, does not precede practice, but is formulated by codifying those best practices which people felt were in order. What do we mean when we say in order? Is it a law that tells us what to do or what not to do? And if so, who determines that? Is it a principle, like a scientific principle of causality, which says if you do this, it will result in that? It is neither of this. We can only say what it is not. It is not a scholastic conception that can be articulated in a language. Louis Kahn famously said, order is, full point, period. They did this after trying out a dozen different ways of describing it, and then gave up, but acknowledging at the same time that it is. We can only sense it. But the language, any language, does not have the capacity, the vocabulary to express it. That is what makes a difference between architecture and technology. An engineer starts with a problem for which he is looking for a technical solution. He knows the problem and he can define it. An artist designer, on the other hand, is not expected to start with a clear knowledge of what he is looking for. A sense maybe, but not knowledge. Knowledge calls for a clearly definable, a priori statement of an idea. Nor is an artist aware of what may guide his choices. I believe more often than not, an artist is searching for an appropriate expression for that sense of order. And this search ends precisely at the moment he arrives at an image, which shows him in temporal form, forms that can be perceived by the senses. Look, for example, at the sculpture by Rutusward at the United Nations Plaza in New York City. It expresses the futility of violence. But most likely, he came to this image through a process which is often painful and frustrating, of sketching and exploring and rejecting and modifying many images before he came to this, when he may have explained, aha, this is what I have been looking for all this while. In other words, it's a revelation caused by this image. He had a sense of what he wanted, but he realized it only when he saw a concrete image. Such a process requires a catalyst, a metaphor, a sketch, or a model that can trigger this revelation. An architect has to constantly strive to arrive at this state of being in his work through his choices. And this is not an easy task. That is what Le Corbusier meant when he said, creation is a patient search. I believe He was searching for, or speaking about, a search for that sense of order where everything fits and nothing can be changed without changing the whole. The idea of order existed in every civilization. It does exist in every civilization and refers to rules and rules of composition that identify work as complete, whole, or perfect, and whose particular order sets it apart from its surrounding as a world within the world. Each art form, architecture, painting, sculpture, music, etc., they all seek order, though they each employ tools that are specific to the medium. While the medium of architecture is space, that of music is time, and that of dance is movement. In visual arts, for the early man, it was the human bodies, which provided this catalyst or a ready-made template of that which is complete, whole, and perfect. Such a divine model exists in music also. Indian classical music is an excellent example of this. In the melodic structure of music, time plays an important role. Each of the melodic configurations, rag, consists of swaras, octave notes, in a specific intonation, relative duration, and order. Many of the ragas aim to create rasa, that is a sense, feeling, or atmosphere of a particular time of the day or season, such as Vasant refers to spring. Some ragas refer to morning, midday, or evening, the time of the day. An abstraction capturing the essence of that time is the divine model of the music. For example, Raga Pilu, an evening raga, conjures up the rhythm of life of a typical dusk in a village by evoking the end of the day, the cowherds coming home after a day's work, women longing with anticipation and excitement for the arrival of their lovers, and the anxiety of the approaching night, all through the matrix of 10 notes. Did you feel it? Could you sense the time? The end of the day, but not yet the beginning of the night? The ambiguity, the restlessness. The time of the day is thus abstracted into a sort of a divine model, consisting of these 10 notes. And each artist is free to improvise around this, but keeping within the ambit of the matrix. Within this decatonic structure of 10 notes, in a particular ascending and descending configuration, the music has an order. And in this case, the order is Pilu. There are other ragas, Bhairavi, Todi, Malhar, Malkos, Marwa, each with a theme and order which render each a specific identity and uniqueness. Just as each work of architecture has the uniqueness derived from its own unique order. However, with the emergence of autonomous individual with a unique mind in the West that we saw in the last session, relying on an archetype or a divine model was not enough. Man is now looking for a deliberate and willful way for the crystallization of readily graspable forms, forms which immediately causes some sensations. In other words, he's looking for that act of design, meaning thoughtful organization of parts in an entity. Aristotle also had, in his treatise on poetics, already defined this as an orderly arrangement of parts, which has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Greek language refers to these as aisthetikos, also defined as perception of senses, implying that it refers to an entity which has the required attributes to convey to us that completeness and order. The word aesthetics is derived from aisthetikos. Still, the Greeks, including Aristotle, did not distinguish between order and aesthetics. That distinction appeared in the 18th century. Today, though, we consider order as embracing other domains, such as social, political, economic, etc., as when we say law and order. For example, economic order or social order, hierarchy or caste system. These are all order which implies thoughtful arrangement of parts. Aesthetics, on the other hand, has come to be referred to those areas which are concerned with perception of senses, arts. Though Alberti in the 16th century never refers to either order or aesthetics, it was in the original sense that he gave us this simple but elegant formulation: edifice, that is building, equals design plus matter. Design is a search for order that it assumes beauty. He writes, we consider that an edifice is a kind of body consisting, like all other bodies, of design and matter. The first is produced by the thought, the other by nature, so that the one is to be provided by the application and contrivance of the mind, and the other by the due process and choice. This design is a search for order, and it subsumes beauty. It is produced by thought and thus has no material presence and can be perceived by our senses only when it is embodied in the material body of a building or a work of art. That is the reason why Alberti speaks of preparation and choice. Each part of the building has to be chosen and prepared thoughtfully and carefully bringing together the visual, the emotional, and the rational. Only then it will be perfect and complete. That is in order. Unlike in biology, where it refers to self-organization and selection, as in Darwinian sense, in architecture, both the organization and selection by the designer is now conscious, deliberate, and willful. But what is chosen has a sense of inevitability. Order is inevitable. The break between order and aesthetics began soon after when, in the 17th century, Claude Perrault, a French physician architect, he was actually a medical professional with a degree. He was the first to classify Greek architecture in terms of the 5 orders. We often assume that this classification of the Greek orders may have been there right since the time of the Greeks, but that is not the case. Greeks may have practiced this intuitively, but it was only Perrault in the 17th century who looked at them and codified the Greek architecture for the first time in these 5 categories based on the dimension, proportions, ratio relative to each of these orders, and named them, actually given them an identity as Greek or Corinthian or Ionic order. His second contribution to architectural history was to propose 2 categories of beauty. One was positive beauty, what he called, which refers to the classical orders and is to be applied to the public buildings or grand villas or castles for the elites. And second, the arbitrary beauty, which can be found in the ordinary buildings common people build for themselves. As can be seen in this upper left hand, the Palace of Louvre or the large castles for the kings or for the elites, and they would adhere to the classical orders. While the common people who would not care for all that, Perrault classified them as arbitrary but still beautiful. By dividing this, he began to talk about beauty applying to all architecture, but in a different way. This is a very good example of theory being born out of practice. Perrault simply rationalized in the theoretical form architecture which was already being practiced. While Perrault theoretical work provided a rational explanation for the popular architecture which did not adhere to the classical canons, strictly followed by the elites and public architecture, this fragmentation, the dichotomy it caused in the idea of beauty, there are 2 kinds of beauty, the positive and the arbitrary, was problematic and needed to be resolved. It took another half a century for it to be resolved as a coherent theory of aesthetics. Now, we know that even though the idea of aesthetics as a discipline devoted to the study of art was already known since the ancient times as aisthetikos, the term aesthetics was appropriated and coined anew for the first time with a new meaning by the German Alexander Baumgarten in 1735 as episteme aesthetic, or the science of what is sensed and imagined, that is beauty. Notice the term science, episteme, systematic knowledge, is now consciously aligned with science and rationalism, and beauty is being seen from that point of view. Baumgarten addressed the arbitrary beauty of Perrault, which dealt with taste and custom, and he defined taste in its wider meaning as the ability to judge according to the senses instead of according to the intellect. Such a judgment of taste he saw as based on feeling of pleasure or displeasure. But pleasure is not a measurable identity or measurable quantity. And Baumgarten aimed to remedy this infirmity. Simply put, we are now looking for a rational and verifiable rules for declaring something beautiful. Actually, it was only in the beginning of the 20th century that Bauhaus introduced a course in basic design and sought to evolve a coherent vocabulary of aesthetics and a visual language for the day-to-day use objects, including architecture, for the common people, that the gap between positive and arbitrary beauty was breached. Unfortunately, in many of our academic programs, we are stuck still with the basic design notion to introduce the fundamentals of aesthetics, forgetting that in its true and original sense, it implied a comprehensive notion of order, not just visual. And order connotes a synthesis that produces architecture, music, painting, etc., even poetry, in any culture, and follows analogous path. Each of these art forms do the same thing analogously, tempered only by the respective mode of their own expression. They may differ from similar expressions of different culture. No one cultural expression can be said to be superior to others. However, in all cultures, there is one crucial point that distinguishes architecture and settlements from other forms of expression. For in building their settlements, humans have to come to terms with their assumed relationship with nature. Unlike, say, music, architecture has physical presence through which, once erected, a building becomes an integral part of the natural environment, external environment, both natural as well as man-made, but external nonetheless. To that extent, it is part of the nature now. Thus, through his building environments, humankind negotiates between his macrocosmic conception of the universe and the microcosmic conception of himself. That negotiation takes place through architecture. It is through ordering of his built cities in settlements and buildings that he negotiates these two extremes. Throughout history and in all civilizations, this relationship between nature and man has also been one of the main determining factors for architectural orders. I have been able to identify three distinct modes through which this relationship between human and nature has shaped architecture. These are: one, natural order; two, geometric order; and third, enfolding order. Enfolding, not unfolding. Unfolding implies opening up. As when you open your gift package, you unfold it, revealing the constituent parts of what is contained in it. Enfolding, on the other hand, means folding in as everything in as undivided whole, as one singularity. The first, natural order. This is most visible among the pre-rational societies, where man's relationship with nature is dichotomous. At this level, humans view nature as far more powerful and dominant than man, yet at the same time positive and beneficial. He is both awed by nature and seeks its protection. The forms of nature such as mountains, ravines, caves, deserts, rivers, and the contours of the land are never altered and are allowed to dominate, with man adjusting and accommodating his architecture around these features. The cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde National Park in Colorado, USA, is an excellent example of natural order. Looking at this makes it obvious that the Pueblones, as the people of that time were known, the Pueblones of the 14th century who built this complex have respectfully accepted the mountainside location as sacred and sacrosanct and built their habitat within the bosom of the benevolent nature. Another example is the settlements in the Thar Desert in the northwest of India. These settlements are still being occupied and carry the tradition of building human habitat in the middle of the seemingly hostile desert. The vastness of the desert is recognized, accepted, and respected. However, unlike the cliffs of Colorado, the desert does not offer a protective bosom. Man has to identify his domain in a way that sets it apart from its surrounding, with a clear demarcation of its limits and an internal order, to follow Aristotle's definition of order. Completeness. This is done here by clustering various elements around a courtyard, raising the plinth just so, and defining the entrance by a cut in the wall that is more a defining element than a protective one. The material of construction is that which the desert provides, mud and thatch. Apparently, there is minimum of foregrounding or world making in both these examples. There is a minimum attempt to clearly identify the human settlements from the nature as distinct, world within the world. This is the characteristics of the natural order. Man does not see himself so alienated from nature to proclaim an independent identity. There is a desire to fit into the natural order with a minimum of disruption. Whatever world making is done, it is unself-conscious and non-assertive. Geometric order reflects man's increasing self-consciousness. Self is identified increasingly with mind and the fascination with the product of cerebral activities, such as number, geometry, the ideal relationships of measure, ratios, and proportions, results in an imposition of geometric order over nature. The 5th century Greek city of Priene is the example of this. The plan of the city, as reconstructed by archaeologists, shows a regular grid layout of square city blocks, presumably residential quarters, interspersed with public agora, theater, or gymnasium. At first, this looks like a fairly straightforward and sensible urbanism. However, on closer look, we realize that this plan is a conscious superimposition of regular planar geometry over a highly contoured landform. The natural character of the land is neglected in favor of the human geometry. Geometric order is supreme here. Needless to say, unlike the natural order, there is maximum foregrounding and world making here. The relationship of man and nature is that of polar opposites, almost adversarial. Man seems to think of nature as something he has to control by imposing his will, and the instruments of doing so is orthogonal geometry. The clearest expression of the dissimilarities between man and nature. After all, nature does not draw right angle. You won't find a right angle in natural forms. There is no doubt that this is a conscious and willful act on the part of man. The geometric order then springs from the self-consciousness of a man as a rational being distinct from nature. This consciousness can also be referred to as reflecting consciousness, consciousness that reflects upon itself. It is in the nature of reflecting consciousness to reflect upon the objective world around it, the world of nature, in an attempt to find and articulate laws that govern it. Much of the civilization in the West has been built on this relationship between man and nature, in which man has been consciously trying to look at and analyze nature as an outside, objective world, outside of himself. It has led to a phenomenal development, not only in architecture and urbanism, but also that is on the visible level, architecture and urbanism, but also on a science, literature, music, on a non-visible level. This order has been highly suitable for the analysis of the world into separate phenomena, such as objects, artifacts, particles, field elements, etc. But at the same time, this has also resulted in an unfolding understanding of nature as that which unfolds and reveals itself as made up of parts that can be studied independent of each other. This is what science does and is able to do spectacularly. A very different relationship between man and nature has been imagined by other civilizations like Indian and Persian. As the name enfolding order suggests, the world is not seen as made of separate entities like the nature and the humankind, but as a whole enfolding upon itself, coming together in perfect harmony. This unity and wholeness does not view human and nature as distinct entities with an adversarial relationship wherein one dominates over the other. Man is the trustee, custodian, and guardian of nature and cannot destroy or violate the integrity of nature. And this in turn resulted in very different superstructural manifestations, such as architecture and urban design. It is the confluence of a human program and on the one hand, and the natural character of the site on the other, that eventually produce architecture. Islamic worldview regarding the man-nature binary is highly sophisticated. It says the universe has originating from God, returning to him, and centered on him. But this universe is not God, and neither is it a reflection of God. In fact, Muslims are forbidden neither to equate nature with God nor to represent it. Human, on the other hand, is made from the clay from nature and therefore part of the nature to the extent of his body. There's a very clear distinction between the body and the mind, but we'll see it's different than the Western one. But God, having breathed his spirit into the human, he or she is set aside from nature and given the special responsibility to preserve and protect nature. At the same time as when Europe was struggling to define beauty in measurable terms in the 17th century, the Persian city of Isfahan, located at the center of the Iranian plateau, reached the height of its architecture and urban development and provides a good example of humans building their city in harmony with nature. At the heart of Isfahan is a large open public space, Maidan-i-Shah, also known as Naqsh-e-Jahan, image of the world. A gigantic public open space of almost 90,000 square meter area. The long axis of this rectangular space is orienting in the north-south direction, with the royal precincts, gardens, and ceremonial boulevards taking up area on the west of the square. It is apparent from looking at the plan that while the Persian architects and planners knew the geometry well, the ceremonial boulevard and the gardens are laid out in perfect geometric patterns. The lay of the land and its topography mandated positioning the Maidan-i-Shah at an angle away from this geometry. And this is readily deferred to. Here we can see the Maidan-i-Shah right here, the palace, the mosque, but the other areas are, they display incredible amount of geometric sensibility. But it is what happens on the north and south ends of the square, actually rectangle, that substantiate points made above in a more emphatic manner. The royal mosque, Masjid-i-Shah, occupies the northern end. Wherever they are in world, Muslims are expected to face the Kaaba when performing Salat, the prayer. This determines the axis of the mosque, which too is not in line with that of the Maidan. Geometry is brought in here to resolve this anomaly at the north Iwan, where the two axes meet. While the axis of the Maidan runs like this, the mosque is settled so that it faces the Kaaba at Makkah, the sacrosanct place that all Muslims revered. This is the neck connecting the Maidan with the mosque. The meeting of the two axes is resolved through geometry. This geometry, far from dictating the order, as in the case of the Greek cities, it is brought in the service of the order where not only the natural and human orders, but also the transcendental order of the Islamic belief are all enfolded in the architecture and urban resolution. When we say a house, our mind immediately conjures up an image similar to this, an image of a domestic enclosed environment, comfortable, secure, and protective from the vagaries of unpredictable nature, and sufficient for us to carry out our daily domestic activities, such as being with the family, social activities such as entertaining guests, or private activities like sleeping, cooking, dining, etc. A diagram showing the order of this environment will look something like this. Each of the domestic activities is encapsulated in a specifically assigned space, which we call room. And several of these spaces, the rooms, are enclosed within an outer enclosure. This is the simplest example, but even if the complexity of the lifestyle change, there is a larger family or various other locations, etc., the generic order will still remain the same. There is an underlying and implied relationship between man and nature in which nature is perceived to be uncomfortable at best, except for few period of good weather, and at worst hostile. The house is a microenvironment completely separated from the outside. After all, we are told quite often that a house is a man's castle. The metaphor of the castle conjures up all signs of medieval hostilities. A typical Indian house, on the other hand, shows a very different and sophisticated resolution of this man-nature dichotomy. A non-adversary relationship with nature has always been a cultural condition of traditional Indian society. This amounts to accepting and establishing a dialogue with the element of nature. Historically, this has left us not only with images such as veranda, chalk, jarukas, otlas, etc., elements that has been evolved as part of the domestic architecture. Not only that, but also at a far more abstract level. A very unique plan form has been evolved for a house. Rejecting the idea of a house as a collection of activities, such as sleeping, cooking, eating, entertaining, etc., into encapsulated spaces. A typical Indian house can be diagrammatically represented by the three concentric circles. The outermost represents the open terrace over or around the house or a courtyard, which is a bedroom for the summer nights and for the sunny hours of the winter, a place for women to do their housework and for children to play. The second circle represents the loggia or verandas, closed from above, but to protect from sun and rain, but open on the sides to allow all the breeze to come in. That is a year-round space for sitting, sleeping, or cooking and eating quite often. The innermost circle stands for the enclosed spaces that resemble the conventional notion of a room. These are bedrooms during the winter nights, day rooms for the hot summer afternoons, or when extreme privacies are needed. The house is thus a dynamic environment, changing according to the cycle of seasons or day and night. And in the process, it becomes a threshold between the finite world of man and the infinite world of nature. It is an active zone of negotiation between man and nature. Whether it is the Nalukattus in Kerala or Chettinad houses in Tamil Nadu, or Havelis in Rajasthan or Gujarat, or house in Himachal, where the climate is similar to that in Europe. Variations and improvisations do occur, but the order represented by the three concentric circles is adhered to, like the 10 notes of the Raga Prelude we heard. Order is really all around us, and it transcends any consideration of aesthetics and beauty. . Earlier today, I have briefly touched upon two ideas: world making, that is the world within the world, and enfolding order. Both are important and need to be elaborated more than I have been able to do today for lack of time. However, in the next two sessions, I intend to address this.